Hi, good afternoon and welcome everyone. We are very pleased to have Helena Norberg-Hodge and Michel Bauwens together with Don Yip and Professor Ishlao Nafti. Today, the conversation is an extension of the Future Ready series. The Future Ready series of events is a tripartite partnership between Institute of Policy Studies, the Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities, and Tote Board. Last May, just May, 10th of May, Tote Board launched the Future Ready Society Impact Fund with $6 million to support the futures research. So LKY CIC's role is to identify trends and opportunity areas, and IPS's role is to try to incubate solutions to test their viability or feasibility. And the theme for this year is on resilient families and empowered communities, which is why we have Michel and Helena here with us. Helena is going to talk about how local action can lead to systemic change of localization as a solution multiplier. And she's the founder of Local Futures, and I can actually put her website here, and I'll put also Michel's website in the chat, so you can check it out if you like. Local Futures and P2P Foundation. And Local Futures is a pioneer of the worldwide localization movement. It's kind of like a paradox whereby you try to encourage localization, but you want it to be a worldwide or global movement. And Michel has his own terminology. It's called cosmo-localism. So there'll be lots of interesting concepts like that we're trying. We'll be discussing today. Helena in 1986 won what is often promoted as an alternative Nobel Prize. This is called the Right Livelihood Award, and it's an international award to honor and support those offering practical and exemplary answers to our most urgent challenges. Michel is the founder of the P2P Foundation. He's been advocating and researching and cataloging in his website the potential of peer-to-peer and commons-based approaches to societal change. And Michel is Belgian but based in Thailand, and Helena is Swedish and based in Australia now. And we're just Singaporeans based in Singapore. What I want to do now is so what will happen now is Helena will present, then Michel, and then Don Yip, who's the coordinating director for the SG Partnerships Office at our Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth, will comment, and then Professor Ishlao Nafti, sociologist and associate dean at the Singapore Management University, will then comment and give his reflections. And the reason why we have discussions is because we want to hear, basically, my mind is stretched by these ideas, and hopefully others can lend their insights and help us all make sense of these ideas, which I feel are, as Don and I was saying, this really stretches our imaginations and challenges our assumptions, but in a good way. And so we want to, without further ado, can I invite Helena to share with us? Please, Helena, over to you.
Thank you. Well, I'm very grateful for this opportunity to stretch your minds. And I'd like to start by stretching your minds back in time and across the globe to look at the beginnings of this global economic system that we have today. It really started from Europe, and it had been helped by Christianity, where there was a fair amount of trade and economic conquering going on. But as it became formalized into a global economy, it was very, very much benefited by slavery, genocide, and the enclosures that drove people into bigger and bigger cities, and that pushed people away from producing a range of products for themselves, for their region, in order to specialize for export. This then became formalized as a principle of comparative advantage in the modern economy. And the principle was, it doesn't make sense to produce a whole range of things. Focus on what you're good at and then export it, and you can import what you need. This, of course, would have made sense to most people, because I think forever until recently, things from afar were very special. They were valued. And I really believe that the reason that we have multiple crises today, from inner spiritual, personal, depression, loss of identity, to, of course, climate change, to mountains of rubbish, to an ever widening gap between rich and poor, astronomically widening before our eyes in every country. And of course, globally, we see how billionaires are getting richer and richer, while even the middle class are getting poorer and poorer, having to work longer just to put food on the table and have a roof over their head. The reason for this is that this global economic system has imposed monocultures across the world. It has been a disaster for the natural world, and it has been a disaster for human cultures. It has led to this imposition of monocultures that are simply deadly. A fundamental principle of life is diversity. I believe that the main reason this is continuing to escalate, the power of the few who are dealing globally, not just in goods, but in money, this system is continuing to grow because of blindness to that bigger picture, to really stretching our minds, as I say, to look back in time and to look across the globe, to really try to understand this global economic system. We hear a lot about system change. There is a lot of language now with concern, of course, with climate change, with as I said, these mountains of rubbish, toxic chemicals that are being released with virtually no protection of human health or ecosystem. In order to understand why that's happening, we really need to look at that fundamental aspect of the global economy. We need to look at a way in which governments have been continually subsidizing, taxing, and regulating to support global players at the expense of local. And I feel from personal experience, talking to ministers, even prime ministers, Nobel Prize-winning economists, academics across the world, highly respected people, leaders in virtually every community. I do not see this happening through personal greed or ill will, essentially blindness, and perhaps a bit of a self-editing thing that makes it feel very scary to talk about excessive power in the hands of global corporations and global banks. Now, when we do that without a politics of identity, without blaming any particular company, any particular individual, when we blame ourselves for not having really looked at this, when we understand that there's this collective ignorance, I believe we can start talking about this, as I say, without blame, without anger, and we really need, I hope, can people hear me? Something happened on Zoom now. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, but the screen is wonky. Yeah.
Yeah. Is it my internet?
I'm not sure.
Should I just continue?
Yes, go ahead. We can hear you.
All right. So I think we have an opportunity to do this in a holistic way, in a way that is not founded in anger, that is not blaming any particular company, any particular bank, any particular country. Of course, we have to acknowledge that since the Second World War, it's the US government that has been supporting this process more actively than others. But still, We need to look at this. We need to look at this, how this has affected people within America. We need to look at the truth of what's going on. And we can immediately now start supporting a process of localization, systemic localization. Michel calls it cosmo-localization. I mean, absolutely, a localization that awakens us to our interdependence with the cosmos, a localization that reconnects us with life in a way that is fundamentally spiritually empowering, psychologically healing, and that reconnects us with the living community around us. That social reconnection, creating interdependence at a human scale, where we see the people we depend on, where they see what we do. There is a social, community, natural, ethical structure that is built because of awareness. When you and I are shopping in a global supermarket, in a supermarket supplied by farmers from around the world, we have no idea of our impact on ecosystems or people on the other side of the world, just like the CEO of big companies have no idea. We end up caught up in a system of assumptions based on a complete lack of experiential knowledge. We're talking about knowledge that is mediated. We're talking about knowledge that is manipulated, because, of course, the giant corporations want to maintain their power, and it's their duty as publicly funded corporations. It is their duty to operate like machines that see profit as their reason for existence. They have to provide to their shareholders. So once we understand that this globalizing path has led to so much destruction, and we need to look honestly at the fact that these corporations have managed to create a situation where countries routinely import and export the same product. And when we talk about food, which we should do, because food is the only thing humans produce that all of us need every day. Food is the foundation of health, healthy ecosystems, and healthy people. And it has been turned into a toxic, machine-like production, moving more and more towards promoting synthetic food instead of farming. What is happening? Well, what's happening is that giant corporations would not make money if you sat down in Singapore tomorrow and ate food entirely from the region. If I did the same, I'm actually in the UK right now. If I did the same thing here, if around the world people were eating food from their region, no multinational would be making money. But if food is imported and exported, so as now the US exports as much beef as it imports, the UK exports roughly as much milk and butter as it imports, and routinely food is sent to the other side of the world to be processed. I have found that from Tasmania, from Norway, from the US, fish is sent to China to be processed, sent back again. This is an insanity on a planet where we're talking about climate change as the biggest threat to our existence. To have this insane trade continue is simply not acceptable. And we should all make it a duty, take it on our shoulders to speak out about this. As I say, there is no particular anybody to blame, but there is the need now to blame ourselves if we don't speak out. This trade back and forth, and we're talking, of course, also about water and timber and electronic goods, electronic waste, plastic waste, nuclear waste, all of it transported back and forth, is going on without permission at the climate negotiations to even mention trade. Emissions from global trade are not included in any accounts. Instead, we hear this fictitious discussion about a particular country's footprint. But of course, we can't measure a country's footprint when production and waste and everything we use is being manufactured and traded across the world. So we need to start looking at those emissions from global trade, and that's a number one priority. And we need urgently to explain that localizing is a win-win-win. As I said before, the win-win for human beings to reconnect to real life people is it's essentially a return to who we are. It's how we evolve, connected to other people. Perhaps in Singapore still you have a memory of what it means for children to have more connection with the elders, to know their grandparents, maybe even their great-grandparents. This connection, it turns out, is vital for our psychological well-being. It's vital for creating a sense of identity where each child is known as a unique individual and loved and respected the way they are, seen and heard by a multitude of voices. These are connections in the family, but also beyond that, neighbors, community, and the people who provide the food we need, who provide the building materials, who help to build the houses, who help to make the clothes. Is there any reason at all why across the world we couldn't start supporting the localization movement to have most of those basic needs met from closer to home? We need to understand that this absolutely means reducing emissions as we shorten distances. It means reducing overnight the need for plastic packaging. We had for generations, we had returnable glass bottles where drinks and yogurt and what we needed was sold in those containers that were then returned, washed, and reused. This is beginning to work in the new localization movement, but it is working in a system that subsidizes the distances, that subsidizes the big corporations, and that has brought in regulations that are, yes, needed for giant global corporations, but they are being applied to small local businesses and very often destroying them. So we need to start looking very carefully at the way taxes, subsidies, and regulations shape the direction of the economy. In the meanwhile, before real policy has taken place at the national level, what's happening is from the bottom up, people are subsidizing, people are creating the structures that they know are right. They are reaping results by reconnecting producers and consumers. Most powerful of all is what is in effect a global local food movement. In that global local food movement, we are seeing that as you shorten the distance between the farm and the plate, what happens is the market pressures the producer to diversify. It's exactly the opposite of what the global system did from day one, hundreds of years ago, pressured regions to specialize, to produce monoculture for export. This shortening of distances has a structural, systemic effect of encouraging genuine regeneration of biodiversity, not just in the soil, as the now emerging regenerative agriculture movement emphasizes. In the soil is vitally important, but even just as important, if not more important, is diversity above ground. That diversification, which can restore small, truly regenerative, organic, natural farming by helping farmers to have animals in the cycle, animals that never compete with human consumption. They eat waste or they graze on land that is not suited for cultivation. Animals, vegetables, fruits, trees, both for timber, but also for food purposes. All of this is happening. We have demonstrated in the local food movement that you can always produce more per unit of land and water if you diversify. You also create a protection, an insurance for the farmer who knows that one flood, one hailstorm will not destroy everything. So you're reducing dramatically the need for fungicides, herbicides, pesticides, insecticides overnight. This leads to an organic and natural shift towards healthy, sustainable agriculture. What it does also is to connect people with the land. And we have discovered that when people connect with the land, there is a deep psychological healing that happens. Throughout the world now, there's more and more eco-psychology, ecotherapy, healing through nature connection. It is showing that it heals because that's how we evolved, connected to plants, to animals, to the living, breathing world, to life. And it brings back life to people. To people, I have seen hardened prisoners, torture victims, people who suffered from depression, angry teenagers, healed from the help of a deep reconnection to nature. When that's done in community, in a group where you journey together, it is even more powerful. And what we've discovered is when the connection to land is an ongoing, productive journey where you are also developing skills to grow food, to produce something that people need, that they value, you have found a recipe for the most remarkable healing. All of this that's happening now, and it is happening because people care enough, often to abandon well-paid jobs, to go and live in a way in a smaller town, away from the big cities, to a smaller town that is more human scale, with more connection to the land, more connection to farming. People are leaving well-paid jobs, earning less money, but gaining their lives, gaining back their joy, their humanity, and their vitality. So this movement, heavily subsidized by the goodwill of people, is a testimony to an innate desire, is a testimony to the fact that human beings are not by nature greedy and competitive. In fact, as some of you may know, my journey started in a remote part of the world called Ladakh. It's the westernmost part of Tibet, but it belongs politically to India. I ended up there by chance. I was a linguist. I was living in Paris at that time, a big city. And I was asked to go out to this unknown part of the world to try to pick up a bit of the language for a film team, to make a documentary film about this unknown culture that had been sealed off from the outside world. No one had been allowed to go there. I arrived in Ladakh in the mid-70s and overnight fall in love with the most vibrant, joyous, and beautiful people I had ever met. I end up staying at first to do a PhD on the language, but later I turned to trying to find a way for Ladakh to meet the modern world without being destroyed by it. I saw that almost overnight, as the area opened for development, in came images of who you are supposed to be, images that made young children feel that working on the land, having dirty hands, even living on the land, farming, was backward and stupid. Young children got the message: if you want to be loved, if you want to have people respect you, see you, you need to be wearing those Nike running shoes, you need to be drinking the Coca-Cola, and you shouldn't be seen dead in your own clothes, eating your own food, holding your grandmother's hand. That's not cool. I saw how this commercial global system, which by the mid-70s had gained power to enter virtually every culture on the planet, was misleading children to go down a path of consumerism to meet their deep psychological need to belong. This psychological need was now created. This is an artificial need that creates greed, insecurity to fuel consumerism. And as I said, with the healing that's going on with farming, and as I said, with angry teenagers, prisoners, we're showing how the reverse can almost overnight reap results. So we should all do what we can to support this growing localization movement that's happening against the tide of, as I say, taxes, subsidies, and regulation that roll out the red carpet for global business. In the meanwhile, people power. And I have to say, most of the initiatives that I know about, and I do know about thousands, many thousands, are led by women. It's a very female-led emergence, which is, of course, understandable. We know women are more connected to their children. They are more connected to the natural world. And so this movement is responding to what is also a cultural turning. We can see that the dominant culture, which started with these global traders driving people away from the land, had misogynist values. They were racist, and they were, as we know, even hunting indigenous people until not so long ago in Australia, for instance. So those values were, as I say, racist, misogynist, and of course saw nature as a threat, something to be subjugated. We can see that there is a huge cultural turning now, where we are beginning to respect the feminine, the indigenous, nature, the love for nature, the desire to bring in eco-psychology, even eco-linguistics, eco-theology, ecological architecture, ecological agriculture. There's virtually no discipline that doesn't have some eco or alternative in front of it. We want to turn towards nature, towards each other, reconnecting at a human scale, reconnecting at what is a deeply ecological scale, because everything in life is unique and changing. That is the truth of this remarkable web of life, this dance of life. There's a beautiful movement out there where people thrive when they dance in tune with that magic of life. On the other side, we have men in particular who are so infatuated with technology that they are wanting to take us down a path led by AI, already now supported by AI in the financial casino, an AI that makes it possible to rule the world, only ever seeing human beings, plants and animals as numbers, never facing them. They are numbers subsumed under a worldview that believes that we, human beings, and I as a man, we are going to create a better reality. We're going to create something better than life. We're telling people, oh, you're not going to have to die age 80. No, we're going to do magic. And in fact, robots are more kind, more wise, better than human beings. This path is promoted by a minority, but it's being promoted very actively and particularly emphasizing health, which has always been the way to introduce new technologies, potentially life-destroying technologies, introduced with individual cases of benefit. I believe, again, without demonizing, without pointing to the particular Elon Musks or Bill Gates or any individuals. We need to be looking at this worldview. We need to be looking urgently at this divergent path. We have essentially two paths before us, towards life itself, or embed with technology, and technology that requires massive amounts of minerals, mining countries already to pieces. We're talking about substituting natural materials to create artificial structures. And we're already talking about fighting on Mars, the deep seabed, to find more minerals. Let's join the movement for life. Let's be clear. Let's have a clear no, a loving no. Many of these men are infantile, and of course, there are women supporting it too. But let's have a really loving no, but a very clear no. Let's have an immediate embrace, explore the joy of nature, explore the joy of community. By the way, another truth from traditional cultures and the way we evolved was that we had not only a participatory economy, we had a participatory culture. We had a culture where we made music, where we danced together. It wasn't a culture where most of us sat in front of a screen listening to someone who earned $1 million to sing to the world. We didn't have a culture where 8 billion children dreamed of being the one famous singer or dancer or film star. We had a world where multiple cultures, multiple languages, multiple races were able to thrive and maintain self-respect. In order to build that movement, we urgently need international collaboration. We need international cultural exchange. We need to come together as one humanity to support this flowering of diversity, to support each other to go smaller, while we come together to prevent the big from preventing us to go back to life. So returning to life, returning, as I say, to the unbelievable wealth that you see when you open your eyes to the uniqueness of everything in the living world. You know, every cell, every leaf, every earthworm, every cell in our bodies is unique and changing. When we return to a culture of appreciating that change, we don't fear growing old. We don't fear ourselves changing to become old, because in those cultures of place, those nature-based, localized cultures, the elders have respect. The elders remain connective, productive parts included in the community. So there's a way forward that really we have to call the economics of happiness. I hope you will watch our film, The Economics of Happiness, and I hope you'll listen enough to your heart, to your body, to really want to do what you know at a deep cellular level you need to do to thrive as a human being, completely engaged in and a part of the web of life. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helena. Thank you so much for that. I was expecting an economics lecture, but I received a spiritual one as well. Now to Michel, because I think I had a chat with Michel, and he seems to have a more positive view of technology as having potential. So that'd be kind of interesting to explore later. Michel said that I asked him how he came to this journey, and he said that he had he was working in a telecoms company, and he was asking himself whether he was hurting or helping the planet, and he says not helping. So he took a sabbatical, and 18 years later, this is where he is. So can I invite Michel to please share some of your views with us today?
Yes, thank you. So I think you can hear me. I'm just going to click on share screen. Hopefully I'm doing this right. Okay. So please tell me if you can see my screen. Okay, and then I have to click somewhere to make a view. All right. Yes, so it's a bit difficult to come after Helen. Because I do actually have, you know, kind of different take on technology and the role it can play in the transition, because I think at some level, you know, I share the basic conclusions that we've kind of arrived at the end of a certain road, and that we have to move to a biocentric civilization. So the kind of way I put it is, you know, we went from an immature biosphere to a mature biosphere at some point. It was a great oxygenation event, and a lot of things started happening. And living beings started cooperating to make the Earth into a kind of homeostatic system that could preserve life over the long term. And that created human beings with culture and technology. We are fundamentally technological beings. From the very beginning, it is actually what distinguishes us from the animal kingdom. You know, this kind of conscious use of tools to organize our life and our relationship with nature. And so I think we now have a technosphere that is not able to live in balance with the biosphere. So we have an immature technosphere. And so what I see as the big transition is this evolving capacity that we have to learn under very difficult circumstances with, you know, global catastrophic risks and a meta crisis, to shift towards a mature technosphere. So I do actually think that it's how we deal with our technology that is going to determine in a certain way where we are going in the future. And so I think digital networks are a game changer because they create what I would call non-territorial coordination. I think civilization was fundamentally a relationship between the country and the city. So it's when we responded to a climate change crisis 12,000 years ago, humanity decided to develop civilization in order to survive against this challenge of nature. And so civilization is basically a particular way of looking at nature as something that needs to be mastered, that needs humanity to be organized in a certain way, but it's a geographic relation in a way between the city and the countryside. And so the capacity that we now have for global non-territorial coordination, I don't think it's like a marginal feature. I think it's a civilizational changing feature. And so, you know, the chip was invented in 73, if I'm correct, maybe 71. But I date the big shift in 1993 when we democratized digital networks. So the browser and the web created the capacity for billions of people to self-organize, to communicate with each other, to create projects together, and to actually create new value circles. And so if you look at that first slide, it's simply saying like, this is already the case, right? When I'm not talking about the future, we are today have 4 contending worlds, worldviews, practices that use this technology, this capacity in a particular way. So one is what I call, so you have this quadrant, so it's centralized global versus distributed local. And then the horizontal scale is for-profit and not-for-profit. I just want to make sure that you understand not-for-profit doesn't mean non-profit, right? Not-for-profit means that profit is not the primary aim. So you can actually produce profit, but it can be subsumed to social and ecological goals. That's what I mean with not-for-profit. All right, so we have one model which combines global centralized models with peer-to-peer at the periphery. So when you join Facebook and you use Google and Uber and Airbnb, you actually are in a technology that capacitates a high level of peer-to-peer relationships, but it's only at the interface level. When you're in the back end, everything is centralized and proprietary. So I call it netarchical capitalism. And I have this a bit provocative thesis where I say we move from a Marxist capitalism to a Proudhonian capitalism. Because Marx said, surplus value comes from the surplus from labor. And if you look at these companies, which are not dominant, these are the ruling companies of our day, they make us cooperate, they make us exchange and share, and they tax directly our corporation. That's their business model. Not exploiting labor like the old style, but actually directly exploiting peer-to-peer and commons-based relationships. Now then we have in the bottom left, distributed capitalism. This is also very important. I live in Chiang Mai. Before COVID, we had 25,000 digital nomads. There are now 34 million digital nomads in the world. And a big part of this sphere, which used to be $3 trillion, is now $1 trillion after a number of crises, but it's still huge. It's a huge economy that has a dream of making every individual into an entrepreneur, right? So this is the world of the Bitcoin, of the blockchain, of distributed ledgers. All of this is now also co-emerging. Okay, then we have global commons. With that I mean these huge global communities like Linux, Arduino, Wikipedia, that have created massive collaboration with tens of thousands of people, hundreds of companies using the commons model, so shared knowledge, shared software, or shared design. And then we have, and this is, I think, more what Helen is talking about, what I call the localized commons. So I did a study for the city of Ghent, and so I counted the urban commons in the city of Ghent. In 2008, there were 50. In 2016, there were 500. So 500 projects in one city where provisioning systems have been transformed through these new paradigms of peer-to-peer relationships and creating common-based infrastructure. So access to organic food, community land trusts, cooperative housing, co-working, co-housing. There's a huge amount of change that has happened in the last 10, 15 years around this paradigm. Now, if you would put these two quarters on the right together, you arrive at what I call cosmolocalism. And cosmolocalism is basically a new way of thinking about the relationship between space and the virtual. And the rule is very simple. Think of it that way. Everything that's heavy is local, and everything that's light is global and shared. So we are talking about a model of production and value creation where there is a relocalization happening, and there is a new wave of technology that we call distributed manufacturing. So there is a relocalization happening, but at the same time, there is a cooperation of knowledge, technology, and science through either completely open commons or semi-open commons. Just an example. So we have a book about this. It's called the Cosmolocal Reader. We have about 40 case studies. One is the multi-factory movement. So we have 120 entities in Europe. So these are craftspeople that work with materials, wood, metal, 3D printing. They take over factories at the fringes of the cities because it's cheaper to do, create cooperative models and use open source. And they have something called the invisible factory, where they share their technological development. And so there's 120 of those. This is just one example that we mention in our book. So let me go to the next slide. So I think this is very important. So I think this is a civilizational shift, right? Because it's a new way of thinking about space and physical and the virtual space. So before the Industrial Revolution and capitalism, we thought value came from the land, right? And then we shifted to the idea that labor and scarce commodities creates value. I think we are now also at the eve of a new paradigm shift in terms of what we consider value. And this we can see if we look at this commons-based economy. So we see there is a new value regime. In this system, we believe that the value is created by all the contributors to the common pool resource. So think about Linux. All these companies, IBM, Red Hat, all use the same common pool resource, the free software. So their business actually depends on the contributions of this whole network to develop what they use for their own business activities, right? So what that means is we are moving from a commodity-based value regime to a contribution-based value regime. And so around these common pool resources, we see emerging market activities. So I would argue that even the most capitalistic new companies like Google, Uber, Airbnb, they would not exist without this. They're all based on these dynamics. They could not afford Yahoo, Google, Facebook could not afford to be what they are today if they were not resting on this amazing infrastructure of common pool resources which they use in their technology, right? So then you have market activities that create added value on top of these contributory resources. And here the question is that a generative market or an extractive market? So there is a self-interest in these contributory communities to transform the market forms that they work with into generative market forms. I don't know if you know things like radical exchange. That's like a global think tank, within the distributed sphere that works on generative market mechanisms. That's what they think about. That's what they do. That's what they try to develop. But also it requires a change in the planning level, right? In the state level. So this is where I talk about the partner state. I'll give you just one example so that you kind of get what is happening. So in Bologna, they started something about 10 years ago that was called the Bologna Regulation for the care and regeneration of the urban commons. So it created a city lab or a commons lab, and it allows any group of citizens to propose improvements to the city, what they call social innovation projects. There is a negotiation between the city in this lab and the project, and they sign a commons accord, which has rights and duties for this project. And then the city becomes the convener of support. So it's called the quintuple helix model because you have public authorities, the commercial sector, the nonprofit sector, and the research sector, that those four combine to help number 5, which is a social innovation, commons-centric citizen initiative, right? So this model has been now copied by 250 cities in Italy and mobilizes 1 million Italian citizens. So this is what I call a partner state, because the paradigm is no longer I am a state and I produce welfare for citizens and workers as consumers. But so the state, the public authority, becomes incapacitating. It creates commons of capabilities. It promotes social and individual autonomy. And here's my argument. So under neoliberalism, the task of the state is to attract capital. Because there's nothing worse than what is worse than being exploited by capital is not being exploited by capital. So there's no development at all. But I think today the shift in paradigm thinking around the partner state is what can we do to attract all that talent that works on common pool resources, right? So I can tell you, and I mean, that's my point of view, that those 25,000 digital nomads have an enriching effect on Chiang Mai. So they bring talent, they bring knowledge, they bring dynamism, and they create these new activities around. All right, so the next slide is simply to maybe explain that, of course, there's tension in this sphere as well. So, for example, as a reaction to what I call netarchical capitalism, there's now an emerging movement called platform corporativism. So it's the same basic model. You create a platform where supply and demand and people can share and collaborate and exchange. But the platform itself is owned by the stakeholders, either by the workers or by the consumers or by a multi-stakeholder. So in other words, the surplus it doesn't go to remote shareholders, but stays within the platform itself and can be reinvested in the platform. So there's a lot of work done also in the blockchain economy. And so this is something I call ledger cooperatives. Sorry for all the jargon. But basically the idea, so I work with an outfit called the Crypto Commons Alliance. And so we are trying to introduce more cooperative value models in the more libertarian, proprietarian sphere of the blockchain. Because it has a particular ideology, right? It's this idea that every person can and should be an entrepreneur, and that the market functions, is the primordial value, right? And so I would be a bit more critical of this this thing, and to balance it out with social and ecological values. Okay, so I want to say something here. Why is this happening, right? So this is controversial, but I'll say it anyway. I think you can look at history as a competition between coordination systems and their elites. So there are different modes of exchange, different modes of coordinating societies. One is the market and one is the state. Market pricing and state planning. And you could argue that there was like an East Eurasian imperial form, state sovereignist, where the state is the dominant and actually manages the market and keeps it under the control of the society, and a more market-oriented, maritime-based, trading-based Western model. So to be a bit blunt about it, I don't think you can be an oligarch in Russia and China without approval of the state. And I don't think you can be a politician in the US without the approval of capital. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but that's what I mean, right? So it's particularly significant in this context that we now have a third coordination system, mutual signaling. So open source, the blockchain represents a shift to open ecosystems of collaboration. That's their historical role. So let's take Wikipedia. How do you know what to do in Wikipedia? It's very simple, because you can see it's a holoptical open system where everything is visible. So you can adjust your activity without market pricing and planning commands. It's like a real-time accommodation of human beings working on the same complex project. So I think this is very significant. And I want to say a word about the commons. So I have this other theory. It's called the pulsation of the commons. So every society has ascending and descending phases. So every civilization has been cyclical. Every society has been cyclical. In the ascending phase, the extractive institutions, based on conquest and competition and harvesting a surplus for their own society, for their own elites, when markets and states function well, the commons tend to weaken. However, when the peak moment is past and the market and state functions less well to provide goods and services, then what we see is a revival of the commons. And so you can see this tension both in agricultural societies and in capitalist societies. Karl Polanyi talks about the lib-lab cycle. So 30 years in which you have high growth, that's good for labor, you get welfare reforms, but then you have a peak supply crisis, so capital is not making enough profit. There's a counter-revolution, Reagan and Thatcher, and then you get a financialized wave, the descending wave, which lower growth rates, good for capital, but not so good for the worker, for the producing classes. And it ends with a demand crisis. There's not enough money to buy stuff. So that was 2008, 1929, 1873. But here's the thing. We have now an international state system and a transnational financial system. So the capacity of the people to put pressure on their governments and their societies to re-equilibrate this relationship is fundamentally flawed. If you would really try to do something radical, within 100 days, your ATMs are empty and you can forget about it. And this is what I think we now need to think about: cosmo-local, global commons. So I call this magisteria of the commons. And I think they will evolve out of these organizations that we see evolving out of open source production. So you have, Linux Foundation, Apache Foundation, Wikimedia Foundation, because what they are doing basically is to enable and facilitate the global cooperation of their digital network, of their ecosystem. So they function a bit like a state, if you like, although there's no command involved, but they create the conditions. So I call them also protocol cooperatives, right? Everything you need to cooperate is located at a translocal level, and then local forces adapt. Okay, so I'm not sure about the time I have, but I just want to say two things. So accounting is how we see the world, right? Is how we account for value. So accounting, the first proof of accounting is a ledger in Sumeria. And if I'm not mistaken, it's a temple and it regulates the grain coming in and out of the temple. So it's the birth of the state, an institution that is outside of the people and that regulates value and invents taxation and armies and everything that we know as civilization. Then in the 15th century, Lucio Paccio, a Franciscan monk, invents double entry book accounting. And that's the birth of capitalism. The problem is that within that system, we only see our own entity, what we are making in terms of money, the capital that is growing, the profit that is growing. And I think what we are seeing now is a shift towards contributory accounting, flow accounting, and thermodynamic accounting. These are all being developed in these circles to manage their affairs. And so they represent this shift towards an ecosystemic vision, right? Where every actor in the economy can actually see his impact and his contributions on the ecosystem. And this is also where I think cryptocurrencies come in, because we now can have things like Fishcoin, where an intelligent money can tell you the state of the fish, and you can't overfish because there's a limited supply of the coin. So the coin is thermodynamically informed, right? So here's what I see. Maybe I'll end with this, and then I'll say how it's related to Helena's vision. So I see a three-layered economy evolving, with the bottom layer being stigmergy or mutual signaling. The second layer is generative markets. And the third layer is thermodynamic planning, right? So how do we stay within planetary boundaries? We can either have centralized planning and rationing, or we can think, can we not create a system where everybody can see what their limits are and still be free in how they conduct their lives and make economic and social decisions, but within the limits of these global thresholds and allocations? Now, it may seem very idealistic, but if you look at history, what usually happens is there is conflict, and then the cost of conflict is so high that people say, how can we avoid this kind of conflict in the future? And that's when major reforms are usually instituted. So I think we are now at such a threshold where we're in a very dangerous global situation. The danger of war is real. But the difference today is that we can actually not afford to go to World War III. And so I think these ideas, therefore, are very important in finding a way out of this, systemic struggle that we have today between two global systems. Okay, so how do I relate to Helena? So I think we agree on many points. The shift. So I think localization is a necessity, because we spend 3 times more on transport than on making. And so the system that I'm proposing is moving from economies of scale to economies of scope, doing more with less. So if you have a network, as I describe it, any change in the whole network is available everywhere in the network, right? So it's kind of so for example, there's this project called Arrival. So they redesign car making from 700 to like 50 processes. They have a platform, and then municipalities can order vans and trucks that are made on demand. So there's no mass marketing, there's no mass production. And so this is what I'm advocating, is a systematic mutualization of provisioning systems using these new models. So here's the difference with what I think is the potential danger with pure localization. So there's a study of the Incas, and as every civilization, it kind of grew and retracted over time. But when it retracted, 90% of the people died, because the local people didn't have this complex agricultural knowledge, with this kind of trapped agriculture with 50 different biotopes. And I think that's a real danger of, the other point I would say is you can have like a fishing commons in Senegal, but as long as you have the big ships, just emptying your ocean, this is not good enough. And this is why I think we need to basically create a counterpower at the global level that are those magisteria of the commons, so that you have international states, transnational capital flows, but you have a civic, translocal, institutional setup that can actually protect human and non-human communities and the vital resources. So I think that is my approach. So it's kind of more embracing of what is happening in the field of technology, but also, ideally is this same shift towards much more localization. So I call it the subsidiarity of material production. So I have no idea how long I talked, but I think this is kind of like a wrap-up. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Michel. Before we go to the discussions, I think wanted to say that the reason why I asked Helena and Michel to share with us, because their ideas, well, abstract, my brain is imploding, is that we have a current paradigm of assuming that technology and economic growth and governments and large corporations are the ones that can most meaningfully solve our most urgent crisis. That's what most of us think. And here, their proposal is that somehow small-scale local efforts, disparate in nature, is somehow the solution, that somehow communities might be the solution. It's not that state and markets are not important anymore, but somehow small communities, if they somehow connect to one another, they might have scale impact if they become open and connected to one another. And so I wanted maybe to have Helena and Michel, because what you shared is relatively abstract. And Michel shared a few examples of Bologna. What is maybe to bring it down to a concrete vision of what is a community or a society or a kind of economy that you would imagine is wonderful? Because Yeah,
So
go ahead, Michel.
let me give you maybe one or two examples. So one is from Brazil, two executives from a large coffee company. And they said, why don't we have good coffee in Brazil? Because the best coffee is exported. That's the answer. And why do the producers of coffee why are they so poor? Because all the surplus is being appropriated by others in the supply chain. And so they completely rethought the thing using digital networks. Here's how it works. So first of all, everything is transparent. So where does the coffee come from? Who are the farmers? How do they do it? It's all visible. Second, they design a distributed coffee roasting equipment that can be used locally by the farmers, and it quadruples their income, right? Because they eliminated a intermediary which was capturing the surplus value. So now it's for them. Third, they created a coffee commons of knowledge where everybody is sharing blends and how they make coffee and what's a good mix. Fourth, they do crowdfunded retail expansion. They ask their community, like, if you want coffee close to where you live, help us to pay the rent of our stores. So they invest in the rent, and the coffee is the dividend, right? Which again is brilliant. Then in the store, you have a poster which tells you how much the coffee costs, because everything is transparent. But they actually sell tokens, and people pay what they want, and they happen to pay 10% more on average. So they went from one store which I visited maybe in 2013. Then when I went back just before COVID, they had two big hangars, and they were trying chocolate and cheese with the same model because it was working well. Then COVID came, they had to close down everything. But I got a phone call from him 6 months ago, and he says, Michel, we're back in business. And by the end of the year, we'll have 25 stores. So why is this interesting? Because this is a model that is not even a company. It's a network. It's a network of stakeholders that are cooperating through mutual signaling, where everybody has its place. And I think this is a very interesting example of rethinking how an economy could work. Of course, it's small scale, right? But it's still kind of interesting. Okay, then another example, just to make it real. Okay, so Solar Lamp is a project in India, open source. So that's the Cosmo part. So everybody can download the designs of this lamp and make it if they want. So then they make it. So lots of small Indian companies produce a solar lamp. It's been sold and distributed to 4 million students in poor villages which had no access to electricity. So all these kids can now do their homework and participate in schooling. And what is it called? The I think it's called IIT. The ITT, the Mumbai, the Technology Institute. Sorry, I forgot what the name is, but it's like MIT in the US, right? So this outfit then created classes for these students, and 400,000 of these 4 million students obtain credits online to join the university. So again, this is a system, there's no company there. It's a collaboration between the university, the villages, the schools, so this is kind of networked economy, a network society model that is emerging out of this. I can give you, so we have 40 examples in our book. And, I would argue that, in every city that you would go now, you probably have 2-3% of the economy, which is functioning already around these models. People mutualizing, like, okay, why can't we get cheap organic food? And then they create things, right? More or less following these models and using technology to organize themselves. Even the relocalizing of food, like you take Australia, it's happening to the Open Food Network. The Open Food Network is the commons of the food relocalization movement in Australia. It's used by many players. And so this is the answer to your question. So we have to stop thinking that only markets and states have the knowledge. The interactive network civil society is probably now smarter than the state and the market. So I'm not arguing for the abolishing of markets and states, but for a moving from the binary to a trinitary model, right? Because we struggled for 4 centuries between lib and lab. Should the state dominate or should the market dominate? This is the struggle, you know, of Western societies, probably Singapore as well. I remember I talked to you, Lee, and I joked that Singapore was right-wing socialism. So in a way, kind of like a good mixture of both, you know, thriving market, but also you have housing and health care for everyone. But that was a discussion in the industrial society. But now in the cognitive society, it's different. We need to marry, and you know, but I do agree with Helen that we are over virtualized, we are over mediated, and so high tech needs high touch. So to a certain degree, we need to reorganize and recreate the links that young people have with the land, with crafts. And this is going, I agree fully with Helen, that score is going completely in overdrive. And so I think this cybernetic machine that we created 5,000 years ago with civilization is escaping our control. And this is a big crisis so that if we want to preserve our biosphere, we will have to domesticate this cybernetic machine that we've created.
Thanks, Michel. And maybe that's a good segue to Dawn, because Dawn's role in MCCY is to build community, and of course, communities do not exist in isolation. It's embedded in an economic system that you may not have any direct control over. And I imagine that, you know, I have kids in schools and in states, they might be best of friends, but it's such a hyper competitive environment. They're not helping each other learn, and neighbors can't. After working all day, have no time to be neighborly. So I wonder if, Dawn, you can share some insights on your work in MCCY, and also the ideas of how there's the state, and in Singapore, the state is trying to grow community, or the state and the market, and this third logic of the commons, and what you feel about it. Over to Dawn.
Yeah. Hi, thanks, Justin. Just to check that you can hear me all right. That's great. So I just wanted to thank Helena and Michel for their quite mind-expanding presentations. And I think I'll just say a few things just to give us lots of time for engaging in the Q&A. So I'll start first by responding to Helena's very impassioned reimagining of what global society could look like. And I think my reaction may be similar to some of you who live and work in Singapore, that it is almost a direct challenge to the Singapore model, right? Because Singapore, our very existence, our very model is premised on globalization. We were birthed at the junction of global trade flows and being a trading port. And in fact, people from all over the region came here, not just to make a living, but also to make their life. And so to fundamentally shift from this will be difficult, at least in the near term. But I must say, I mean, I was really excited by that vision. And I think some of what, some of the challenges and drivers that both Helena and Michel referred to, we are not immune to. Things like the sort of loss of connection, the mental wellness, the uncoordinated actions leading to silos, and the value of networks. And that very much, I think, is what we are facing to in Singapore and in the Singapore government. So what all this adds up to, and it's the work that I'm directly involved in, is a shift that we're making in government towards collaborative governance. We have a little sort of catchphrase for it, which we call Singapore Together. It's something that was launched by one of our deputy prime ministers in 2019, and it very much correlates to Helena and Michel's remarks around localization, connectedness, decentralization, and partner states. I thought maybe the best way to frame it is around 3 shifts, what we're moving from and what we're moving to. So one is that in terms of governance in Singapore, we're trying to move from consultation to also co-creation and co-delivery. So one good example of this is in public policy and programming. we're trying to invite citizens and stakeholders in to the process more and more. One example of this, and I think Justin, IPS has been involved quite a lot with this, is our citizens panels. They're similar to citizens juries and citizen assemblies in Europe, and that's the idea of convening a group of interested citizens and stakeholders to tackle a particular issue. And government actually is just the facilitator of the process. It's not a direct intervener, nor even sort of directing proceedings. And then the citizens will actually make recommendations on what we ought to do. So we've done this for quite a number of issues, including, I think, quite notably something that Helena addressed, which is how to increase consumption of local produce. In Singapore, we have this ambition of producing 30% of our nutritional needs locally by the year 2030. And for Singapore, that's pretty ambitious because right now, over 90% of all our food comes from outside Singapore. So that's the first shift, consultation and towards co-creation and co-delivery. On co-delivery, many examples opening up for volunteering by the community towards public good. So things like volunteering in mentoring, even areas like citizen science. Citizens can get involved in terms of documenting migratory birds and dragonflies and butterflies. We've got citizens involved in community gardens and peer mental wellness. So a lot of opportunities are opening up, directed by government for citizens to get involved in the public good. The second, and this relates quite well to what Michel was talking about, that we're moving from hierarchies to also deliberately building networks. And a good example of this is what we in Singapore, we call the Alliances for Action. And these are typically 3P partnerships. They bring government, citizens, stakeholders, and the people sector together to tackle big issues or even big opportunities. And here the government is not directing, it is one of an alliance member. And some examples of what happens here, one good example is we have something called the SG Cares community networks. The premise is a straightforward one, that as much as we want to provide social support and social care at the national level, actually it is ground players, community players that are most familiar with what the ground needs are and where the ground assets are, in fact. And so we're convening all these networks across Singapore. So I think they're organized by town, will have one of these centers that brings together volunteers and matches both the demand and the supply and the assets. So that's the second shift, hierarchies to networks. And then the third that I was going to mention is both top-down, which Singapore government, we tend to do things very well centrally and very efficiently and very proactively, also opening up more to ground-up initiatives, so both top-down and bottom-up. Increasingly, we're trying to facilitate and catalyze ground-up action. We've seen ground-up action in areas like recycling, food rescue, community libraries, and we're also, in fact, providing funding, networks, resourcing for ground-up groups that want to do these things. And so actively stimulating these kinds of initiatives from the ground. And then maybe the last thing I'll say, just hearing both of you speak, what I think we need to move towards is a group of people who have systems leadership capabilities. So Michel, you talk about ecosystem awareness. So not just thinking about leadership from an organization lens, but an overall ecosystem lens. Helena, your big vision is going to take real leaders, understanding all the different dynamics to bring together. And I'm noticing that, so organizations like the World Economic Forum and the Harvard Kennedy School are putting forward this notion of systems leadership, and it's something that resonates with me. And they speak of systems leaders as having three capabilities. One is they must have insight into system complexity. So they're not just comfortable in government or in a specific economic domain, but must be able to see across to the system complexity. And the second capability is the ability to build coalitions and to advocate for issues. And the third is to be skillful in collaboration. So I think my hope for the work that I do in government, and perhaps also contributing to the work that you both so strongly believe in, is that to the extent we're able to build this kind of systems leadership, I think we'll be able to overcome some of the big issues and crises that are facing us today. So let me stop here, hand the time back to Justin.
Thank you so much, Don. We move now to Professor H. Lau. I've asked him to kind of situate the conversation in terms of what the academic thinking is. Who studies these things? What do they call them? Is it an extension of the critique of capitalism and neoliberalism? Is it a social movement? Is it prefigurative politics? Is it a realist utopia? Who talks about these things, and how do we make sense of it for people who want to study it? Over to H. Lau.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much to Michel and Helena for these really expansive, open conversations, full of new ideas to challenge us and provoking thought, and to Dawn as well for helping us get a more Singaporean perspective on it. So I should thank Justin as well for setting me these impossible questions of like, who all talks about this and how to situate it in sort of an academic and intellectual history. So I think we can start a critique of capitalism. I mean, why not start with Adam Smith, right? Who also wrote a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments about the individual human experience within a capitalist system and how the successful capitalist sacrificed his own well-being in the building up of a profit-making enterprise. So from there and onwards, Karl Marx was mentioned at least once. Can we leave it at that? So these very real critiques of capitalism exist within mainstream intellectual thinking. These aren't, flights of fancy to which others don't subscribe. No, absolutely. It's in the center of so many different disciplines. Maybe I'll mention sort of some sets of thinking which I found informative and perhaps can be shared here, because at the heart of what both Michel and especially Helena were talking about was a local perspective, a human-centered approach to the work that needs to be done to help humans flourish and indeed thrive. And one, Justin mentioned real utopias. So that's a reference to a project by Eric Olin Wright, sociologist, and Arkon Fung, political scientist. And they put together sort of, they captured examples in ways in which governance was effectively done by incorporating sort of ground level perspectives. And they had many wonderful examples. My favorite is participatory budgeting in Porto Alegre, the town of Porto Alegre in Brazil, where some 25% of the municipal budget of this city of 2 million people was allocated according to what local neighborhood sort of level voices advocated for their real need from the state. And, you can take that concept and take it much larger to a part of like when we see, Singapore is a prime example of this, like how did developmental states work? How did certain types of states, particularly within East Asia, grow their economies in such a dramatic manner in the 20th century? And of the explanations that go at the heart of this, there's the idea that state elites worked with industrial elites hand in hand to promote industrial policy, which was successful. And there was a feedback loop at the heart of it. But if you expand that model to look beyond industrial policy, to look at more social policy, you need feedback loops that incorporate ordinary people. So how can you have governance systems which listen to real people and their concerns? And this brings us very closely to what Don's mentioning at the partnerships office at MCCY. And this is the idea of the 21st century developmental state, that most of the many things that governments really care about now are very difficult to do to people, right? The outcomes of interest, and like health is a great example. Like vaccination is perhaps the limit case of something that you can do to someone to make them healthier, which doesn't really require a lot of their cooperation. But even so, it would be a lot easier for the authorities if families turned up with a child at the right time and willingly engaged in a vaccination practice. And you write that larger. Not long ago in Singapore, the war on diabetes was being discussed, where the Prime Minister was advocating for people. Like, it's very hard to help someone deal with hypertension or pre-diabetes or diabetes itself unless they limit their diet, exercise in a way that requires them to be the active participant in the things that are of interest. And similarly, this applies to education. as a teacher, I can tell you that it's very hard to teach someone if they don't want to, be taught, learn a lesson, do the reading, etc. But you take these ideas forward, and the individual human's participation in the thing that we want to achieve for them, for their well-being, is entirely necessary. It's very hard to work otherwise. And that's a school of thought which you'll find a lot of support for, both within developed countries as well as within, the broad sort of scope of what we call development studies, where Robert Chambers in particular was a strong advocate for sort of participatory and locally led practices. And you can find a range of reading under that. The idea of community was mentioned multiple times, and community as being community development, for example, as being a locus in which human beings find both the meaning and value that that is so crucial to them through the connections and relationships that are part and parcel of their lives. You can find that there's a Harvard study, usually called just the Harvard study, tracking multiple generations of originally just men, but eventually expanded to their families. And the primary determinant of their well-being over this long run was the quality of their human relationships, which are found in community and ultimately at a personal level and in person rather than through other modes of connecting. Which takes me to one of my most interesting experiences in Singapore, looking at these sets of issues, where the Housing Development Board, the HDB, had something that was called a community build-a-thon, an activity that they were hosting at their HDB hub, sort of the headquarters of the HDB. And they invited a keynote speaker from Seattle, who was, he was originally a community organizer, but he then worked in the municipal sort of neighborhoods office. And as the keynote speaker, he stood up at this event hosted by the HDB and said, "Government can't build community." And which was a great message for the keynote speaker to be giving. But what he meant, of course, was that government can't do it, but it has to set the stage. And if we're looking at what states and markets remain crucial, and the role of states in enabling the kind of human-centered activity that all parties here have been talking about is really vital. And there's a number of ways that you can do that, but sort of leaving space for people to act within the manner that sort of highlights their most central concerns, because that's where the knowledge lies of how these challenges matter. And that's the heart of the feedback loop that needs to take place for governance to be effective. And people have to have a certain degree of voice and a certain degree of well-being that's impossible without effective states. And there's a wonderful sort of set of studies, sort of more at an urban level. DIY urbanism, do-it-yourself urbanism is a big sort of aspect of that. And of urbanists, you'll see this across Europe in particular, but elsewhere, where you see mayors like Ada Colau in Barcelona or Anne Hidalgo in Paris. They're all talking about living at a more human scale. A 15-minute city is one concept that's come up in there. So these are notions and ideas that come from different parts of the world, all coming back to the importance of bringing life back to a human scale, and how governments, the objectives of governments won't be successful unless that voice is recognized and responded to and is the essential ingredient in effective service delivery. I think there's a few other things I'll mention. One is about sort of organizational studies that, like, organizations want to be participatory, and this is at business level and at different kinds of organizations. And yet the design of the organization is essential to being able to allow that voice to succeed. There's a lovely study on the Burning Man festival that took place in the Western United States. And it's looking like, and it's called basically allowing organized chaos to succeed, and then leave no footprint at the same time. So these alternatives to capitalism have vast and many sort of advocates for them. These critiques are well recognized. And along with it, I think one of the other questions Justin put to me was about how economists organize. So I'm a sociologist, I should say, so I'm less attuned to those voices. But there are economists like Esther Duflo, Stephanie Kelton, Mariana Mazzucato, Carlotta Perez, and Kate Raworth. And so Helena might note that I named all female economists, but this is where donut economics comes from. This is sort of like looking more at how a state has an essential active role to play in serving social good and balancing economic and social sustainability. And Mariana Mazzucato is perhaps my favorite among these, looking at the creation and destruction of value, and how one has to differentiate between firms that do one but masquerade as the other. And I think this is the point where I'd like to connect it back to what Michel was saying, in particular at the end about accounting. So accounting becomes so vital in this exercise because the capitalist firm exists to do one thing, which is to make profits. And so long as that is the only thing that is valued, literally valued, paid for, evaluated, and taken as a measure of success for this basically non-human life form that we have created and allowed to run rampant for 500 years, it's essential that if corporations are never measured on these other things that we are choosing not to value so far, then we can't expect them to change. But the work is being done to sort of open that conversation. You have very successful corporations which orient themselves not exclusively for profit, but for good or for benefit, and the B Corp structure in the United States. So these models are coming into existence. We're having some beginnings of alternatives, but the basic version of economics that is still taught in every university, including mine, is not this alternate model of economics. It's the very basic sort of profit-oriented model of economics. And yet these ideas are well received at intellectual levels, but they won't become effective on a mass scale until the way that we measure the success of corporations changes in a fundamental manner. Okay, I'll stop there, Justin.
Thanks, Ishla. And I'll invite people to submit the questions or raise their hands. But for now, if Don or Ishla, do you have any questions for our speakers, or Helena, or Michel, did you want to reflect on any of the sharing so far?
I'm actually curious if either Michel or Helena have been to Singapore before, and if we had to take an immediate next step towards what you envision, what might that look like?
Well, I've certainly been there quite a few times, but not really getting to know Singapore. I was recently speaking to a young man who grew up there, and I was amazed to hear about the wildlife and the thriving ecosystems very near the center of the town that I have not experienced and don't know about. But I suppose the immediate step that I would like to see is one that you mentioned. If that movement to build, a food economy with 30% comes from the region, that would be wonderful. I was recently on a webinar with someone from Singapore who was was connected to the Nobel Prize somehow, not the alternative one, the regular one. And he was talking about how clever Singapore was. In order to be resilient, they were now dependent on something like 27 different countries for their food supply. And he considered that resilience. And of course, that is not paying attention to the transport, the vulnerability of those transport links, etc. But I think the mobilizing people and government to see the value of having thriving ecosystems around the city and being careful about the enormous pressures now to push everyone into bigger and bigger sprawling cities, because the whole global economy is set to urbanize us. And now with the help of AI, that pressure is increasing. I think we should all be talking about cities that are connected to the region and that don't grow really. No big cities today should be growing. We should be supporting the villages and smaller towns to grow a bit, perhaps, and also support farmers to survive where they are. But I think that would be an excellent first step, that 30% goal.
So yes, I also have been to Singapore a few times, and to be honest, it was a lot greener than I expected. So I saw lots of parks and green areas, and I also like the kind of the care, the social care element of Singapore. I think that's very important, that that you know, I know it's not everything is rosy like in any place, but certainly on average, I think Singapore has not done a, you know, the worst job in terms of green and social you know, social distribution issues. But so this is just a question. I could be completely wrong. I don't really sense there's like intellectual leadership of Singapore around like the area that I represent. You know, I talk to many people and there's hardly anybody from Singapore. So in that sense, you know, despite what you said, and I think that's all good news, you know, the way you talk about participatory processes in Singapore, I think this is all very, very good and going in the right direction. I probably kind of have the impression that the thinking is still very much, you know, state oriented. And, you know, don't mistake me. I think a good state is also important. I think that, you know, the kind of professionalism and training that Singaporean officials have, you know, the low corruption rates, all of that is not something I would say, you know, to give up. But I think the stimulation of maybe more these non-market distributed, you know, to familiarize more people and do more research, I think that would probably be something that I would like to see. So more of a, you know, intellectual move to change the paradigm of thinking, you know, within the Singaporean people and elites.
Michel, what would you advise? Because the state being so effective, even if we wanted to encourage ground-up initiatives, we do it in a centrally planned way, right? And there would be a system whereby we pump in resources, there would be a strategic plan to grow ground-ups. And all that is good, but I'm hearing something else that, you know, it's about encouraging peer-to-peer relationships. It's about network, not firms necessarily. And if there's no intellectual leadership, let's say we have social enterprises or just community groups interested to do this or that, and they are distributed, they're not coordinated, they're all doing their own different things. What's your advice for that? Because we don't have the third sector that's thinking about the commons.
Yeah. So first of all, let me say that I actually did this exercise for Ecuador in 2014 and for the city of Ghent. So I have commissioned commons transition plans that I co-authored. They also exist outside of my participation. There's one in Sydney, Amsterdam. So I think the key is thinking, you know, and maybe it's because I'm a Catholic by culture, but, you know, it's a trinity, right? So stop thinking that there's only planning and market and state. Like, you know, so you plan the market, you stimulate the market, and I think that you know how to do. But I think that the big shift is to understand today that value is also created by everyone. So that commodity value is one thing, but contributory value that eventually actually can create, you know, rich forms of other value like commodity value. That is something basic to think about. Like, okay, so in anything you do, I think you should be thinking, okay, what's the role of the market? What's the role of government? But also, what is the role of the commons and of commons institutions in stimulating, you know, the social creativity, the citizen creativity, and that this is actually also value creation. And actually it may be even, I think, the most important one nowadays. So that's where innovation, you know, I think seriously that, like, for example, commercial research today is very weak. You know, the state has abandoned deep research and companies are only looking at, you know, short-term advances. So a lot of the stuff that I think Helena would see and that I would see is actually people are reinventing manufacturing and farming, and, you know, so in the technical field, for example, you have Arduino, you know, which is like an open source computer, and then you have Garduino, right? And Garduino is people who use these very cheap open source computers to do organic gardening, and to, you know, and then there is a project like the Nutrient Dense project. I don't know if it still exists, but they put together farmers in the Andes and farmers in Tibet, And so they learn from each other how to do high mountain farming, right? So yeah, so this kind of shift from binary to trialectic, or I don't know how to say it. I think that is something that you know, you should be maybe training some people to see the world in this richer way.
I mean, I have an anecdote to share in the sense that given our paradigm, so a lot of the audience in the room are non-profit practitioners, and many of them are service providers. So they take money either from philanthropy or government to deliver a service for clients. And once I thought there was an interesting concept from the UK called community circles, and we thought it'd be great to do a pilot here. So we looked at the website, we studied the materials, and I budgeted for $10,000 to pay for a consultant to come, right? And then I looked at the website carefully, and it had all these do-it-yourself manuals. It had modular videos to teach you how to do community circles. And after we looked at all that, we thought, wow, I kind of feel that we can do it. We didn't even have to budget for a consultant or trainer to come teach us how to do it. So when I finally chatted with the executive director of that nonprofit, I said, you know, this is really great. Why do you do that? And he said in reflection that, yes, everybody tells me this is a really bad business model. But in my mind, that's such a good social model because it's contributing to the knowledge commons, making it freely accessible. Whoever wants to take that and play with can. But within the logic of securing funding from either government or philanthropists, they will ask you to be financially sustainable, right? Once your business model, you cannot always request for recurrent funding all the time. And so most nonprofits who are service providers would be trying to enclose their intellectual property. So in a very kind of concrete case like that, that brought the point home, even if I wanted, I mean, even we thought that commons was kind of cool and wanted to encourage it, it's really hard for these service providers to let go and just share. What's your advice be to that, Michel?
So you know, it's like so if you see it from the individual point of view, you know, it makes total sense. But if you look at it collectively, so for example, who do you think will be most innovative? Like 50 businesses that each have their own research department, right? And they each have access to, say, 50 researchers, or a network of people that has open sourced their innovation, and they have access to 2,000 researchers collectively. So my point is that from a collective point of view, you know, this is much more productive in terms of innovation than private IP. I would argue that the reason that China grew so substantially is that, first of all, they forced the West to share knowledge, right? So if you wanted to invest in China, you had to share your IP, but also that the Shenzhen model, you know, the Shanzai, I think it's called, right? Shanzai model was actually an open source model, right? So you know, it was ethnic open source, right? If you spoke the Chinese of Shenzhen, there was no IP. Like every person that would start a business in Shenzhen would have access to all the IP of all the networks. And so I would argue that the fast growth of China was actually a result of this pragmatic open source. It wasn't legally open source, but it was in practice open source, right? And there's actually a book which is very interesting. It compares Germany and the UK. You know, in the 19th century, the UK was way in advance, right? It was the superpower. And then they introduced IP legislation, and their book production went from 200,000 a year to like 20,000. And Germany, which didn't do it and, you know, had fully open source practices, just shot past the UK. So I think that it's actually, you know, a mistake to think that IP is the most innovative. I think when you actually look at the graphs of innovation, let's say 3D printing, what you see is very fast innovation, then they patent it, very slow innovation, then the patent dies, very fast innovation. So IP, you know, is justified for a certain time to protect investments and individual, you know, creators. That, you know, I understand that, right? But the way it has become it's become a way to defend monopoly knowledge. And so I think the open source model should be seriously looked at as actually a development policy. As you know, so okay, I don't know how much I can say about this, but so there's a lot of Chinese diaspora here in Chiang Mai. I think I mentioned it to somebody in the preparation. And so these people are organized. They share their knowledge. There's something called Global Chinese Commons, and they learn from each other. So those practices that started with Shenzhen and Shanzhai, are still very much alive in these expat communities, and I think it's a big factor of their dynamism. The fact that they share this technical and scientific knowledge, but it's not, you don't see it. They do it amongst themselves, right? So it's kind of.
I would also like to add that I think part of what's happened in China is that the fabric of community and the community spirit is much stronger certainly than in America or in the Anglo world. So this has partly contributed to this development. And that includes, great respect for the elders, much more of that broader identity, which is very important.
Helena,
I would also just like to add, yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
Well, I just want to say thank you again to Dawn and Michel, if that's how you pronounce it, and to Michel. And I want to say maybe especially to Michel that I think we must include the ecological dimension as well. And that's where, from my point of view, once you track the need for social cohesion and respect, genuine respect for biodiversity, and we're talking about respect for different climates, different ecosystems, which is how culture evolved. It was a deep dialogue between a human group and a particular ecosystem. But once you start paying as much attention to the impact on ecosystems and the need to revitalize and both protect and revitalize biodiversity, that's when genuine decentralization becomes so important. And that's also where local knowledge systems are vitally important. I agree with a lot of what Michel says, that of course it can be very helpful to share knowledge. But I worry also about the idea that because something is based on a cooperative, bottom-up initiative, like a typical co-op, in coffee and cocoa and so on, we have to be aware that as they become larger and larger and delivered to a market further and further away, they are also becoming a problem, environmentally speaking. Socially, they may be distributing, well, they do tend to distribute the wealth better, but we must remember that we've got to get back to the reality that it's the real world that feeds us. Everything we need comes from the earth. And how does the earth flourish? How does the earth continue to provide for the needs of 8 billion people? And so then again, I think we really do need to look at the truth of more and more people going hungry right now as ecosystems are destroyed in the name of regenerative agriculture. There's still large monocultures. And of course, we are happy to have our coffee and our cocoa, but let's also get back to looking at how we get the basics for healthy food systems. I believe that if we have as a goal that every group around the world has the right to prioritize this basic food security, we would build a very different intellectual map. And a lot of the knowledge we'd be seeking is from the elders who have knowledge about those specific ecosystems and all that they entail. It's infinitely complex, the local. We have to be much more humble in the face of that traditional knowledge also.
Can I mention something? Just an example of policies that, kind of try to answer this issue of vernacular knowledge that is being lost. So both in Barcelona and in France, Macron invested, I think it was 100 million euros in a program to support maker spaces for territorial development, and specifically connecting the young digital generations with the older craftspeople who are disappearing. So there's a whole, generational knowledge that is dying out in Europe. And so this program is specifically aimed at creating links between the generations and to update the knowledge, if you like, in cooperation between the generations. And I think those are interesting ways of thinking about this, right?
Very much so.
Thomas, did you have a question, or you just have a thumb raised?
No, I just put the question in the question box. I thought you said that. Yeah, I said good. Good answer like that.
Oh, you asked a question, somebody answered it.
Justin, I want to say something. So I mentioned Bernard Stiegler, who was a French philosopher of technology that I liked very much. And, he has this idea that proletarization was actually the enclosure of vernacular language. And so he mentioned to me something that I think is really terrible, is that, so the migrant women in Saint-Denis, which is like a big poor suburb around Paris, no longer knew how to nurse their children. Mm. So, like breastfeeding was something that was no longer transmitted from mother to daughter. And so this is a huge crisis, right? That all these knowledges are being lost and commodified and then resold, but so all that fabric, is something that I think we need to think about and preserve.
Gerard, did you want to ask a question? You just came on.
Yeah, no, I'm just wondering whether it all boils down to the shared core values and whether it should start with education. A lot of these things points towards overconsumption, and we haven't mentioned about empowering the individual to vote with their choices. If individuals have the right values and start over-consuming, that would deal with the overproduction itself. But we don't pause to think. We are thinking about all the system and processes that deals with individuals' choices, which are not based on sound values. And we have to go back to the basics again. And I'm a strong believer that everything starts from education. So you mentioned about women that have stopped breastfeeding and all this. What's happening to the education system? I mean, that's the first thought that strikes me. Why are people not making the right choices? So our education system is helping people to become technically sound, but not necessarily making the right choices in life. And that has to go back to fundamental core values.
Thanks, Gerard.
Yes, I'd like to say something about that. As you may remember, I was talking about seeing in Ladakh how people who were breastfeeding and who were living in a profoundly ecological way, community-based way, were changed as the dominant ideology came in through schooling, through advertising, through the media. And so we have this global system, remember, dominated by giant global corporations pushing consumerism. When I had my eyes open to environmental issues in the 70s, and I went back to Europe and North America, almost all environmentalists were talking about the need for policy change. They were talking about the need for governments to regulate those giant corporations that were now becoming dominant in changing the worldview and values of people, targeting particularly young children. We were all talking about policy change. We were talking about the need to look at the growth dynamic in the economy, how GDP was measured. We were talking about the need for genuine decentralization through also decentralized renewable energy, not in the form that is now being promoted as part of the Green New Deal. I saw how by the late 80s, as globalization was taking off and as governments were signing treaties, giving the corporations the right, the free trade right to enter every economy, how suddenly the discourse changed away from policy change to vote with your dollar. You as an individual, you have the right to have the right values and choose the right product. You see, that is actually saying that rich people have more votes than poor people. That's saying that if you have billions or millions, you can vote with all those dollars. If you have almost nothing, you're not going to have much of a vote, particularly when the reality is that around the world right now, a product that comes from a few miles away costs more than a product that has been transported for thousands of miles. A processed dead food costs less than fresh, nutritious food because of the inversion in the market that has allowed the global players to dominate. So I would urge you, when you think about going back to basics, let's also look at that basic issue of democracy, real democracy, where society can determine, have a voice in what kind of food do we want, what kind of clothing, what kind of building material, what kind of a world do we want. So I think that is, when you look at the big picture. I also wanted to comment on what Dawn was saying about this systems thinking at Harvard and the World Economic Forum. I agree, in almost all circles of people looking globally, there is now this clear demand for more systemic thinking. But I see none of those from those elite circles at the World Economic Forum or Harvard talking about the role of the global economic system, global banks dominating, the danger, the volatility of a global banking system that in 2008 made it very clear that we need a political mechanism to regulate those banks. That has been abandoned, and the message is they're too big to fail. We need to come together internationally for new trade treaties where we agree that we will create steps whereby incrementally those banks and corporations have to adhere to national democratic regulation. Our choice is either a global government with 8 billion people voting, which would be insane if anyone understands the need for trust and visibility. We need to decentralize the economy in order to allow democratic rule to determine the shape of business. And so I think it's a really important issue. Please remember to bring into those fora a discussion of the global economy, the global banking system, which again showed its volatility recently with the bank in Silicon Valley, and the fact that in order to understand what's going on, we need people to look at the global system. What I'm seeing is that people who defend democracy, defend community, defend ecosystem, generally don't have a global view. And that's where I think Michel, talking about networking and so on, is seen as so valuable. I don't think it's the technology that we need. I think it's more the coming together of people who are looking at the impact of the global economic system on cultures and ecosystems worldwide. It's not a big ask. We're not asking for a sudden shift in how we structure things, but we're just asking people to be willing to look at it, start speaking about it, start doing the research that we need. There's almost no research in defense of genuine cultural and biological diversity. How do we achieve that in a world now where everything is moving towards English? You're a nobody if you don't speak English. Do we really want one language? Do we want, or can we create a world where we can communicate, but we can still maintain respect for our own languages, our own cultures, with lots of exchange and real curiosity about the other? We need to question monoculture and really look at that both from biological ecosystem point of view and human point of view.
I would like to get back to Gerard for rejoinder, and then for final words from Ishlal, Don, and then Michel and Helena. Gerard, over to you.
Hearing Helena, it reinforces my view that for decades, schooling has gone completely wrong. That even people from the Ivy Leagues are not able to discern and come out with the right thought processes. So there is an urgent need to address it, but we also must prepare the next generation to have the ability to discern, to think, to have the right values, so we do not perpetuate the problem. So the two have to go hand in hand.
Thank you, Gerard.
Absolutely, completely agree.
Ishlal, any final reflections?
Yeah, so much of what was being talked about was a response to a global problem that comes about from corporations which work at a supranational level, avoiding taxation, avoiding regulation, and with power that manipulates nation states in a way. And so long as they stay out of the ambit of effective influence of regulations and governance, the challenge that we're trying to address will be so much greater.
Thank you, Ishlal. Over to you, Don.
Yeah, so just a quick word, and maybe to reflect on my organization's name, Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth, and both of the C's were mentioned. So I feel quite sort of obligated to sort of say something on that front. The photograph you see behind me is actually where my ministry is located, and the colorful windows really are a symbol of the diversity that is in Singapore. And it sort of stands in contrast with the monoculture that Helena speaks about. And I think for my own reflection on all of this is that you do want diversity. You want everyone to be able to express their individuality, their unique values, their beliefs, their interests and passions. And yet, Gerard was alluding to shared values, right? We need a common set of values to be able to move forward. And so that polarity, that tension between diversity and a certain broad consensus around direction is what communities and societies often struggle with. And I think the heart of it, therefore, lies in networks, in interaction, in ongoing conversations, and a certain give and take that needs to happen. I mean, I'm personally committed to this. And I say watch this space in Singapore, where it's a big experiment that we've been on and we're in the midst of, and I'm hopeful about how we're making progress in this space. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Don. Michel, then Helena.
Yeah, I think I'll just affirm my agreement with the idea that education is a crucial variable. Here in Thailand, I think the average age of a farm is 56. But as soon as you send a child to public school, it will just never want to do anything to do with farming. And so that kind of break, that I think that time is over. We need to rethink education that is rooted, in the land, in crafts. And so I think even sociologically, I think, if you look at the culture war, it's a class war. It's a split between what the physicals and the virtuals, the nowheres and the somewheres, right? So we have a really big danger in our Western society, but probably everywhere, of a secession of the elites, where people like me, we are so in this world of computers and digital networks, and we lose touch. And I think this is a very big danger, because you can't have an elite that is not linked and care for the whole people. And I think we're getting there. So I think this is something that we need to think about, is to, embed education in the real, right? Not just in the virtual. So yeah, it's Gerard. So yeah, I completely share your worry and your sense that education is one of the domains in which we need to rethink what we do.
Thank you, Michel. Helena.
Yes, I want to second that too. And I want to urge people to look at the work of Ian McGilchrist, who's become a great friend and colleague. Ian McGilchrist, who's warning about the overdevelopment of the left side of the brain, which in turn is linked to cutting children off from the hand-eye coordination that we evolved to be engaged in. Most of our time, 90% more than that, of our time on this planet, we were engaged more fully. We respected experiential knowledge. We respected those skills that Michel is talking about that you need for a more land-based existence. So coming back to a balance is really the future. And as I say, please look at the work of Ian McGilchrist and the growing recognition that young people are thriving as they have the opportunity to come out on the land. There's a whole new farmers movement where people are leaving their desk jobs and their computers and thriving because they're actually able to be outside, to use their bodies as well as their minds. Once we wake up to the local, we'll also see that there are these enormous intellectual challenges. There's a way in which that normal, everyday local is so much richer once we open our eyes to it. And I want to thank Justin so much for having the courage to do this. And I know it's possibly a bit risky. I hope it's not going to have negative repercussions. And Dawn and Ishal, and thank you very, very much. I think Singapore has the potential to play a leading role because you have a relatively high standard of living. You are not having to cope with an impoverished population, with the crime levels and so on that are growing in other places. So you have the opportunity for this transition, for doing the research, the discussions, as long as you can just pry open the intellectual window a little bit, as Michel was saying, to become part of the global movement for localization. Thank you.
Thank you, Helena. I didn't think it was risky at all, but even if it was, I just become a farmer, or at least maybe just eat local. Thank you very much again, Helena, Michel, Don, Ishlal, Gerard, Thomas, and everyone else. Have a good evening.